Hello readers, let's go ahead and get this started. I have so much to tell you guys about. I have books, I have statistics, and Hillary from Melted Books has specifically requested that I show off my reading journal, which I've been wanting to do but just haven't really known how to include it in videos. I'm going to start out with my 2020 goals, which were to read one novella per month, read 6 big books during the year, 2 of which I happened to finish in the first month, so that's a great start. 1 nonfiction per month, which I do read nonfiction regularly, but I kind of will do a bunch of nonfiction and then do a bunch of fiction, and I wanted to spread myself out a little more. 1 Margaret Atwood book per month according to the reading schedule for What the Book Club read, as well as 1 classic per month, because I've recently realized I own a lot of classics and I haven't read most of them. So my first book of the month was a physical library book, and that was on recommendation from a subscriber after I read Little Women, and that was Meg, Jo, Beth, Amy. The story of Little Women, and there was more to that title, but I didn't have space to write it down. This is by Anne Boyd Ryu. This met the requirement for my nonfiction once per month. I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. It did a lot of discussion on not just the backstory of Louisa May Alcott and what the book was about, but it also discussed plays that were done on the book. It discussed a lot of it was like the 3 biggest movies that were done on the book. The one with Katharine Hepburn, the one in the 90s, and I think there was another one in there that just wasn't as popular. And it also discussed a lot of her family history and how that would have given her material for writing her characters. I did find it a little repetitive. There were certain parts of the book that could have been cut out because she was kind of repeating herself. But overall, I really, really enjoyed this. If you want to know more about Little Women, I highly recommend reading this book. Thank you, subscriber, for the recommendation. My next book of the month was also my first pick for January Jam Jar. So that is part of the Devour Your TBR, which is a group that I take part in on Goodreads. I did this all of last year. I really enjoyed it, and for this year they decided to repeat their prompts. So this year, with January, we're starting again with January Jam Jar, and you take a bunch of books and put it in a jar, draw them out at random, and that's what you read. So for January Jam Jar, I put a bunch of shorter books. I think these 4 were all that I included. There might have been another one. But I went ahead and put shorter books in the January Jam Jar because I was in the middle of like 3 very large books throughout this month, and I wanted to make sure that I could break that up a little bit with something shorter. So my next book was Love Story by Eric Segal, not sure how you pronounce that name. But you may recognize the title Love Story from the movie. I haven't seen the movie. I don't remember when it was done. But this was actually a book that was written, I think, from the movie script. I don't remember if they released it before or after the movie. But it's also known for being... Okay, I'll put that there. It's known for being a pretty sad story. It's very short. I cried quite a bit at the end of this book. But it's short, it's simple, it's a romance, which I don't typically read, but I am glad that I read this. I think I read it in like a day, or I guess a night, because I remember being on my overnight shift when I started and finished this. And it counted for my novella for the month, so that was exciting. I was already meeting some goals. Next up was also a January Jam Jar pick, and that was What We See When We Read. This was my second nonfiction of the month, so I was really proud of myself for getting all this nonfiction in right off. This one was interesting. So Peter Mendelsohn is a book cover designer. He also recently just did a book, which I will feature here, on book cover design. That is something that I'm interested in. It's something that I'm kind of looking into now that I'm getting ready to go back to college for a graphic design and media arts degree starting next month. Super excited. March 2nd is my first day of college. But this book, I have mixed feelings on. I did enjoy it for the most part, but I was expecting more of a science book on What We See When We Read, where like, this is what our brain's doing. This is how our eye goes across the page. And it ended up being a lot more of a philosophy and theory book. There are a ton of photos, so again, it was a fairly quick read. I didn't finish it as quickly as I thought I would. And that was largely because of the way that it was written. Oh, and see, here you have pages like this where you can't even read, like, all of it, because it's kind of fading here, and you've got this faded picture. So it's more talking about whenever someone describes a character, you can't clearly see that character in your mind. You see the aspects of that character, you have an idea of what that character is, but you don't fully and completely imagine that character until someone tells you to. As for the writing, I'm so-so. That's probably largely because of how difficult I find it to read philosophy stuff. So what it sounded like to me was that Peter Mendelssohn wrote out a philosophical essay on how reading works in theory. And then with every paragraph or every couple sentences, he would just take that little chunk out, take out that sentence or take out that paragraph, give it an entire page of its own, give it a drawing, and call it. Which made it very readable because it was broken up into a lot of itty-bitty little pieces. But also, reading like a philosophical essay, it got dry in some parts, it went a little over my head in some parts. So I do find it really interesting. I'm glad I read it. It's staying on my shelves so I can revisit it in the future. Just reading-wise, it wasn't necessarily the friendliest, but the setup of it did make it much easier. So my next book for January was A Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. I think I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. On Goodreads I gave it 4, but at the same time it kind of felt like a 2 just because it made me so angry. But also, if a book makes me feel this much emotion, that means the author's doing something right. So A Ladder to the Sky follows Maurice Swift as he is stealing material from famous and well-respected authors. We're largely following the author's perspectives. We have the book broken up into different sections according to which author is having their material stolen. And then the final section is from Maurice Swift's point of view. And Maurice Swift is a horrible person. He's a good villain, like very well-written villain, but I hated him, and he never understood that what he was doing was wrong. He would always just be like, well, it's okay because such and such a reason. Another struggle with this book was that the first probably half of it just went really slow for me. I know from reading reviews that it's not readers' favorite book of his, generally, at least on the critic reviews that I Googled. I do think it's a very good book. It's another kind of throughout a lifetime book, like I think John Boyne tends to gear himself towards. But the first half just wasn't quite clicking with me. It went slowly. I wasn't sure why we were there, because you look at the first author, he builds a relationship with this guy because he has a crush on him, and then his material's stolen, and it's like, okay, so that was quick, what's next? And then it goes on to the next person, and as we go on, I got more invested in the book, but a lot of my investment was just, I want to know what happens to Maurice Swift. I want to see him get what he deserves, which I had feelings on this book. I hated the main character, but I also kind of enjoyed it because John Boyne is so talented. I could talk about this book for ages, honestly, but let's go ahead and move on. I've already lost my page. There we are. The Edible Woman. So this was meeting my Atwood book for the month. This is Margaret Atwood's first novel that she wrote, and it was from, the 1960s? This is for what the book club read. Right now we are going to focus on reading one Margaret Atwood every single month, so February's book is going to be Surfacing. I initially read maybe the first quarter of this book in college, and I hated it because nothing happened. And in this reading of this book, still nothing really happens, but I've progressed enough in my reading life and I've changed enough in my reading taste that I actually really, really enjoyed this book. We're basically looking at the life of this girl. She's got a roommate who is very, very different from her. She doesn't necessarily consider her a good friend, but she also kind of looks out for her. They have their kind of roommate relationship going on. She's part of this, like, research company. She has to go out and interview people and ask them questions about certain products so that the companies that own the products can advertise for them. And she meets this one weird guy who, in our discussions afterwards, some people thought that maybe the guy doesn't really exist. He's like a figment of her imagination, which adds a whole other level to this book. But we see her kind of telling herself that she's satisfied with her life, while the actions that she's doing show that maybe she's not as satisfied as we think. I really didn't like her fiancé. I thought he was pretty boring, which may also be why she acted the way she did, where she ended up going out to meet Duncan a lot of the time, and I'm thinking this kind of shows that you're not really happy with your life, you're not satisfied with where you're at. She also finds herself being able to eat less and less and less because she starts associating the food that she's eating with parts of herself. And the one that really got me was when she was trying to eat a piece of cake, and like all of those pockets that you see in a cake, like those, they were maybe air pockets or something, that's what gives the cake its fluffiness. Whenever she imagined those pockets as she was chewing them, she imagined each one being a little lung that she was popping. And that really turned me off from cake for a little bit, because I'm like, ugh, nope, can't do it. Not because I'm thinking of that scene. I guess I don't remember a ton of my thoughts on this book because it was a literary fiction, and those don't generally stay with me for very long. It is a genre that I very much struggle with, but I did really enjoy this. I can see Margaret Atwood being someone who gets me into literary fiction a little more and helps me to understand it a little more. But I did enjoy this book. I just can't remember everything that I had to say about it, which means I should either start vlogging or take better notes, I guess. So the next book that I read was a buddy read with Hillary from Melted Books. I think I mention her in almost every single video that I make, so if you're watching me and you haven't looked at her channel yet, please do. We have some pretty similar reading tastes. We both read kind of eclectically, but we decided to buddy read Mr. Mercedes. I have been eyeing this book on my husband's Stephen King shelf for a while now. I like the covers. I haven't read a mystery in a little while, and I'd also seen the book sitting on her shelf behind her in her videos, and I'm like, have you read that yet? Because if not, we should read it together. I did not love this book whenever I first started it. I did get a lot more involved in it as I went on. As is kind of usual with Stephen King, especially his newer stuff, it's not the best editing. There was a lot of parts that could have been cut that didn't really relate to the rest of the story, but I did like the character development as we went on with the book. At the beginning, I didn't feel particularly connected. You have kind of your typical detective character. He's in a dark place, he's been divorced, he has a bad relationship with his ex-wife and his kids. Like, that's really, that detective trope is probably what upsets me more than almost any other trope, because all detective characters are the same, and it's boring, and I wish Stephen King would have done something a little different with that. This book follows a guy that ran a Mercedes through a crowd at this job hunting event, and he may or may not be looking to kill again. And he goes ahead and writes a letter to the detective telling him what he did and his feelings on it. And I'm like, why would you... what is up with that trope of contacting the person who is hunting for you and giving them physical evidence against yourself by writing them this letter? Like, I never understood that. I did enjoy learning more about the villain in this book. Again, he's pretty twisted. It is Stephen King. but I always love a good villain backstory, and this was a pretty good villain backstory. Overall, I think I gave it about 3 stars. Like, 3 stars for me is I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, I read it, cool. Hillary has decided that she would like to continue on with the rest of the series, so I am waiting for her to get the second book, and I'm going to go ahead and read it with her, because why not? So after that, I went ahead and did January Jam Jar once again and read Judy Blume's Dini. This was a pretty emotional book for me. I did end up creating a vlog for it, which I have partially edited at this point, but I'm also not entirely sure that I'll ever post it. It is pretty personal. It's very long considering the length of this book and the fact that it's a middle grade. I don't know, and I didn't love the way the footage turned out, so maybe I'll release the vlog, maybe I won't. But anyways, Dini follows the story of a girl who has found out that she has scoliosis. She has a pretty toxic mom. Dini is thought of as the pretty one. Her sister is the smart one. They are kind of pushed around in life accordingly. So Dini is supposed to be a model, and her mom is getting really upset with her because the agents are telling her that something is off with her posture. And she's like, "You're not trying hard enough. Your posture is not good enough. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. You have to be a model." Which is already not a great way to look at things. And then Dini finds out that she has scoliosis, and her mom is freaking out instead of taking care of her daughter and her daughter's feelings. I myself grew up with scoliosis. I have a lot of thoughts on this mother-daughter relationship because my mom was super supportive, super amazing. She is a nurse, so she already kind of had an idea of how to handle everything. If I could change anything about this book, as we follow her along like through school and family with scoliosis, I would have liked to see the addition of maybe having the character experience the surgeries. For her, it was just the brace. I myself had to experience the surgeries, and there's not a book that I've really found that discusses that side of it. I would like to see or to read a book at some point on scoliosis surgery and see kind of other people's thoughts and experiences. But nonetheless, this did bring up a lot of feelings for me. I do think it was a very well done book. If you have any curiosity about scoliosis or want to read about a character that has it, go ahead and pick up this book. Next book was off of my Audible. I did love this so much when I read it last year that I went ahead and purchased the audiobook. I kind of want to have a physical book because I like having physical books or physical copies of books that I love, but I loved the audiobook so much that I'm not sure I'll ever buy the physical copy, and that is The Heart's Invisible Furies. This was yet another buddy read. I did this with Murphy Napier. She kind of has mixed feelings on it, which I understand because the book doesn't really have a plot. It's just the life of Cyril Avery in Ireland being an adopted gay man. But I love this book. I'll link my review up above if you want to know more. This is my second reading of it. I read it a year ago at this time of year in January, and I just loved revisiting this story. Then the next book I read was Every Heart a Doorway. This is by Shannon McGuire, and it is the first book in her fantasy novella series. So not only did it meet the prompt for me reading a novella during the month, but it also made me kind of break out of my reading shell a little bit. I have recently finished the Mistborn series, which I actually did complete it in January, and I've been curious about reading more fantasy, and this was allowing me to read more fantasy while not being stuck with a 500 plus page book. I really, really enjoyed this installment. I think there could have been more world building to it, but because of the setup, I understand why there wasn't, because each character in this book, it is a portal fantasy, and you have all of these kids going to this school for kids who have come back from other worlds. And with each kid having their own world, I understand why there wasn't more world building in this book, and I know we get more world building in each of the other novellas as they kind of explore specific characters. I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed it so much that I continued on with the second book, which is Down Among the Sticks and Bones. I loved this even more. We did explore a set of twins who were characters from the first book, and it's kind of a prequel because we're seeing them go into their world and go through their world before the time of the first book, but at the same time, don't read book 2 before you read book 1, because with the way book 2 goes, it kind of spoils what goes down in book 1, which book 1 is a murder mystery, and book 2 is more like horror adventure, sort of, which was really interesting to see. I am hoping to get to Beneath the Sugar Sky in February. I'm not sure if I'll be able to because the hold line is kind of long for it at the library, but we will see. Then I finished Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. This is definitely my least favorite book in the original trilogy. That is not to say that I didn't enjoy it. I gave it like 4 stars, but it's still my least favorite. This book was really, really slow. So at the beginning and in the first half of the book, we're following a lot of characters where nothing is really started up yet. So it's really slow in that way. And then by the second half, we're still following a ton of characters, but there's also a lot going on. So it was still really, really slow because while there's a lot going on, we're still trying to check in with every one of those characters. There were some parts of this that I think could have been cut, especially the first couple of chapters that were dedicated to Vin. It was kind of developing a character that had already been developed. It was telling us stuff about her that we already knew. So I think those could have been cut and this book would have still been just as great, if not a little better. The ending of this series, just, I didn't see any of it coming, and I love it. And I love the way that Brandon Sanderson played with the chosen one trope. For the first time in my reading history, he made it something different, and I loved that. Highly recommend this series if you are like me and struggling to get into fantasy. Pretty much everyone enjoys Mistborn. It's a very, very popular series, so would recommend. Then at some point during January, I had went ahead and filmed my summer haul revisit, which I will link up in the corner. I was looking at books that I'd purchased in the summer, and I was curious and decided to also look back at my spring haul revisit and wasn't too happy with how that had gone. So I picked up one of my books that I hauled in spring and had not gotten around to, which is Michael Crichton's 5 Patients. This also met my prompt for nonfiction, which, by the way, Hero of Ages just Hero of Ages. This met my prompt for a big book. Also, Heart's Invisible Furies met my prompt for a big book. So it was nice to get 2 big books out of the way in a month. But anyways, Michael Crichton's 5 Patients. This was one of my nonfictions for this month. It was very short. The 5 patients in the title are actually each used in their own section to explain the inner workings of the hospital. This is a little dated because it's from the 1970s, but I still thoroughly enjoyed it. It's staying on my shelves. It answered questions I didn't know I had about how hospitals work. Next book was Griffin and Sabine. This has postcards and envelopes with letters in it that you can open up and read. It's kind of a romance. I didn't really like this. It was short enough that I didn't feel connected to the characters. The story I found super, super predictable, but it has a lot of good reviews on Goodreads, so clearly I'm in the minority here. If you're interested in reading postcards and letters that build up a love story and kind of getting a surprise ending, go ahead and pick this up. It was recommended to me by someone at the Friends of the Library, but it just wasn't my thing, which is fine. It is what it is. So the last book that I read in January, I managed to both start and finish in the last 2 days of the month because it was an audiobook from the library. I tend to go through audiobooks really, really quickly. It's the fastest way for me to read, and it's become a way of reading that I really, really enjoy and can't wait to do more of. My Best Friend's Exorcism is written by Grady Hendrix. It reminds me a lot of The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. I'm sure that's where it got a lot of its inspiration. And we're following the friendship of these 2 girls as one of the girls starts to be possessed by a demon. This was another really slow burn book, which when I think of slow burn books, I don't think of it being an enjoyable experience, but I've read a lot of slow burn books in the last year or so and really enjoyed them, which I kind of thank Daphne du Maurier for that. But anyways, My Best Friend's Exorcism, like I just said, was slow burn. But I really enjoyed that because there was so much character development that happened before things really got going, and it really just helped establish this close relationship between these two girls and what their families were like and why they were trying to escape from life, what got them together, and how that ends up breaking them apart as the friend becomes more deeply possessed by this demon. Really enjoyable. I love the way it ended. I would highly recommend this book. However, I would recommend reading the physical or ebook copies, not the audiobook. Unfortunately, the narrator for this book was not my favorite. I almost want to say she was kind of robotic, which isn't quite the descriptor that I'm looking for, but you'll understand what I mean if you go on Libby and search for it in your library and hit play a sample. Just her voice was not doing it for me. I didn't like it, but I enjoyed the book. I went ahead and finished it. 5 stars from me. I do believe this was probably my favorite book of the month. I kind of go back and forth with some of the other books, but overall I think it's one that I enjoyed the most in spite of the narrator. So next up, I have some stats to talk about, which I think people tend to really, really enjoy. I was kind of inspired to do a stats section after Joshana contacted me sometime last year about doing the Read Some Friggin' Books-a-thon, which, if you don't know anything about that, link in the corner, it started off as a joke and it became an actual thing. So we contacted friends who might want to read more, might be interested in reading more books. For January, I started off with 8 participants. At this point, I have heard back from 7. My wrap-up is later than I usually do because I was waiting to hear back from everyone to make sure that I would have the stats for this video. And out of those 7 people that took part, we have 21 books that were read, whether read fully or whether started. I got 21 responses, so I'm really, really impressed with all the people that took part. Out of those 21 responses, 76.2% have finished reading it, 23.8% have not finished and will continue into January. So of the people who were still reading the book, 80% were enjoying the books that they were reading, and 20% were kind of. Like, they were enjoying it, they were going to continue. I don't know how they're going to feel about it whenever they finish reading it. Of the books that were finished, 68.8% enjoyed them, and 31.3% were obsessed with them, which is really good to hear. That means we are off to a great start for the Read Some Friggin' Books-a-thon. For those of you who participated, I hope you're watching this and know that I am so, so proud of you for being willing to take part in this, for really adding more reading to your life, and I hope that the rest of the year goes as well as January did. So on to my own personal stats. In January, of the 14 books that I read, 9 were physical books, 1 was an ebook. Oh, I forgot to mention Every Heart a Doorway was the ebook that I read, and 4 books were audiobooks. I did 4 buddy reads, which that was Heart's Invisible Furies with Murphy Napier, Mr. Mercedes with Hillary, Edible Woman with What the Book Club Read. I count that as a buddy read. And the other one was House of Leaves, which I did not finish, even though I was in 2 separate buddy reads for it with 6 other people. I still hope to finish that book because I put a lot of effort and time into it and will be disappointed with myself if I can't manage to pick it up again soon. But anyways, as for the rest of my stats, let's see here. 14 books read, 10 of them were from America, 2 were from Ireland, and 2 were from Canada. I am hoping to diversify the source of my books a little more, which isn't necessarily the goal of this year. This year is more focused on keeping track of where I'm reading from. I have done a fairly diverse year in the past and was really proud of myself. I do have some picks for the rest of this year that will hopefully break me out of that shell of reading a lot of American books, which, that reminds me, I also should get my map really quick. So I used these rhinestone pins that are left over from my wedding, and this has been hanging up on my wall. I'm just marking which countries I've read from rather than the specific areas just because of the size of this map. I am eventually hoping to learn through graphic design how to make a digital map that I can put in my videos that will have more detail. As far as whether I owned, borrowed, or got the book from the library, or whether it was an ARC, 5 of the books that I read this month were from the library, and 9 of them I owned already. 3 of the books that I read were nonfiction, and 11 were fiction. I'm pretty happy with that. I maybe would have liked to do a little more nonfiction, but I still got a lot of reading done this month, and I'm really proud of that. And as far as authors, I read 5 were female and 9 were male, which is very interesting because when I look back at my reading, I feel like I tend to read a lot more female than male authors. At least that's the idea that I have of my reading. So I found that interesting. But again, it's only January, so we have plenty of time. So here we go with my reading journal. This is for January. I like to play with font, so I put the name across the top of the month and then I did it backwards on the side. Up here, I'm keeping track of my reading goals. I want to read a nonfiction every month, a novella every month, an Atwood book every month for the What the Book Club read book club, and a classic every month. And then the big book is just the at least 6 big books that I want to read during the year. Then we have a spot for the total number of books read. And then this here is a little color code. So this way, whenever I review each book, I can mark whether it was a physical ebook or audiobook by doing a color. And I also have the days of the month written on the side here. And so on the first of the month, you can see I read an audiobook and a physical book by the different colored slashes that I did. I did try to play around a little and do like half and half, but I ended up liking the slash coloring a lot better. On the front here, we have enough room for 3 books to be put in. I have the title, author, dates read, the format, which goes back to this color code here, the rating, which I draw out 5 stars in pen and then I color them in with marker. Recommend, yes, no, maybe. Posted means whether or not I posted my review on Goodreads. IG is whether or not I posted a photo of the book on Instagram. I have a little spot for the genre, the number of pages, where it's from, whether that's my own shelves, the library, whether I borrowed it, or whether it's an ARC. And then I have a space for thoughts. Down here at the bottom, I have my monthly feelings, whether it was a good month or a bad month or so-so. And this little section I call the shelfie, where I drew out little sketches of the books that I read in the month, which I thought that section was fun. I decided not to purchase a specific book planner because I'm trying to have a low buy year. Here I continue on the back. I have room for 5 more books. This for audiobook, you can see instead of number of pages, under this I ended up putting how long the audiobook was. And then I have a space along the side here with a dotted line to add another piece of paper so that I can continue to draw stuff on the other pages throughout the month without feeling like I'm getting in on this space. So I went ahead and attached another page. I filled out most of it and I got to attach it with some pretty washi tape. And then here is my wrap-up section because I realized there was no way I was going to remember everything that I had to talk about in my wrap-up video. So again, I have the month and February is going to go under here. I have the goals that I met, how many books I read, how many of what kind of book, how many books were from whatever countries or were written by male or female authors. I want to keep track every month of my stats so I can have an ongoing stats section. Here's the spot for the Read Some Friggin' Books-a-thon and kind of my numbers on that. And a reminder to talk about the Devour Your TBR challenge that I'm doing again this year. So that is it for my reading journal, and I hope you enjoyed this little section. Overall, I am really, really happy with how January went, and I can only hope that the rest of the year goes as smoothly. As far as February, since this is like a week into February already, it is going pretty well so far. It's off to a slightly slower start, but I'm still really happy with what I'm accomplishing. That is it from me, so please like, subscribe, be my friend or my enemy on social media. Don't forget to ring that little notification bell down below. I post every Wednesday, Sunday, and I will see all of you in my next video. Bye, friends.